continuing teaching about research methods and research and the scientific method as it is applied to psychology. The next few videos are going to be about specific research designs or specific techniques that we could use for research in psychology. Now, a lot of people, they think when they think of research, they think of experiments. Experiments are actually a very specific type of study, and I'm going to go over that one last, actually. I'm going to go over some other non-experimental methods that are available, that are widely used in psychology, or at least could be used in psychology. And so the first one that I'm going to talk about is naturalistic observation. Now, this specific technique is very unobtrusive. Unlike an experiment, you don't really do anything to your subjects or participants. And by the way, what's the difference between a subject and a participant? We generally use the word subject to refer to animals involved in research, and some psychology research does involve animals. When you're involving humans in research, we generally say participants. All right, so observations could involve animals or humans. I'll go ahead and say participants. Let's go ahead and use a human example, even though that's not the only type that could happen. All right, so with an observation, you just watch, you observe. It's a very descriptive technique. You describe what you see, but you don't change anything about the situation. You don't have what we call experimental control. And control just means you control the situation that your participants would be in. With an observation, you just observe. All right, so naturalistic observation is the label that appears in the textbook. I do want to point out that you can have laboratory observations. So what's a laboratory? A lot of times when students think of a laboratory, they think of like people in white coats, maybe with microscopes or a chemistry set or something like that. A laboratory, technically a laboratory, is just a controlled environment. All right, so it could just be an empty room where the researcher controls what's present in the room, what noises there are, what temperature the room is. That is a controlled setting, so that is a laboratory. It's essentially an artificial setting because it's not the same as what people would experience out in the world outside of your study. With a naturalistic observation, you go to where your participants normally would be. So if it's an animal study, you go to that animal's natural habitat. If it's a human study, you might be interested in children's peer relationships. And so you might do a naturalistic observation at their school where you try to be as unnoticeable as possible, unobtrusive as possible. And sometimes we use things like hidden camera for observational research. All right, you can also do observations in the home, in a mall, on a college campus. You know, somebody could be doing a study on campus near the student union where they just sit back and observe people's normal, hopefully normal, usual behavior. We hope we do get usual behavior, and we are more confident that we're getting that when we are indeed not noticed, not disruptive in any way. Sometimes with a naturalistic observation, you do have to kind of arrive early and let the participants get used to you. There's a fancy word for that even. They habituate to you. They get used to you, they forget you're there, and then hopefully they're acting naturally. They're not acting differently because they know that they're being watched. All right, is this a good technique to use? Well, it's useful for studying a lot of the topics that we're interested in psychology. It does have pros and cons. It has some limitations. It has some strengths. A naturalistic observation, it has the strength that you are observing behavior in a natural environment, in a natural setting. Hopefully it is usual behavior. When you do a laboratory observation or an observation where people are very aware that they're being watched, sometimes you get unnatural behavior. Artificial settings can encourage artificial behavior. I've actually seen this happen where I was involved in a study, a laboratory observation of children's temperament. And at one point, it was an observation of mothers with their preschool age children. And this little boy turned to his mom and he's like, "Mom, why are you acting funny?" And she's like, "No, I always act like this." And it was just like, you just knew that the setting made it very obvious. Very, okay, I'm being watched. I need to be on my best behavior rather than my normal behavior, my natural, usual, typical behavior. And as scientists, we want to see the typical behavior. There are important limitations too that you do not have control. You cannot control what we call external or extraneous factors. Another fancy term is confounding variables. Variables that can mess up your results. Variables that are not the variables that you're interested in for your study. They're not part of your hypothesis, but they can also influence the patterns you see in your observations. Like you can't control external noises that might distract your participants. You can't control whether they're showing up hungry or they just had a really stressful test or something. With other types of designs like an experiment, you have more control over the state that people are arriving in, the other stimuli that they're being exposed to for your study. And so there are definitely strengths and limitations to observational research. And remember, there are two types, naturalistic and laboratory observation. Naturalistic, you have that advantage of having natural behavior. With the laboratory, there is more control, but sometimes you get artificial behavior. All right, so some important terms for you to know related to observational research. All right, that artificial behavior. Sometimes we use a specific term, we call it reactance or reactivity. The textbook I'm using this semester says reactivity, so we want to be consistent with the textbook. So reactivity, that's where the participant's behavior is different than their normal behavior. They are reacting to the situation of being observed. Think of one time I worked at a hospital and there were cameras set up. And so anytime people were near the cameras, they'd be like, okay, so I'm going to make sure that I look busy, make sure I don't put lean too far back in the chair here while I'm charting and, just looking. And then somebody said, that camera doesn't work. Then all of a sudden they're like, oh, I can look relaxed. I'm going to act different because I don't think I'm being watched. All right. Think about when you were a kid, parents around versus not around, different behavior when you thought you were being watched. All right. Another important term, observer bias. The way we get data, the way we get results from observational research is somebody has to observe. Somebody has to watch the behavior, either recorded or live, and they have to record it. They have to document, and sometimes they have to code it or rate it, make sense of it in some way. Well, a human being is doing the observation. We have to remember that humans are biased. They are not necessarily neutral, opinion-free. And so observer bias exists when an observer expects to see a particular behavior. They see what they expect to see rather than what is actually happening. So where can bias come from? You can have many sources. It could be because you know too much about the study. You know the hypothesis. You want that hypothesis to be correct if it's your study, so you might see behavior consistent with your hypothesis. This is why with observational research, it's best to have one person come up with a hypothesis and other people, like students or volunteers, help with the actual observation. And then also bias can come from just your pre-existing values, prejudice. All humans have some type of prejudice, and just general pre-existing beliefs about the world. So we have to be very careful with observer bias when we do observational research. Now, when we try to keep our observers in the dark about details of the study, details about the hypothesis, you can have what we call blind observers. So a blind observer is one that knows as little as possible about the specific study. Like you try not to tell them the hypothesis. Just basically they know as much as they need to be able to do the observation, but you try to keep all the information away that could potentially bias them. That used to drive some of my research assistants bonkers back when I had some research assistants with some of the bigger projects that I did before I got a teaching heavy job. You know, they would say, "Can you tell me more about the study?" I'd say, "Nope, not till we're done." They'd say, "Well, what do you expect to find?" I say, "I am not telling you that. Until I know what we find, I can't tell you what we expect to find, because that will give you bias and that will give us bad results." So they'd have to wait and wait and wait, and they'd be like, "Oh, that's what you were looking at. Okay." All right, so those are the sorts of things we have to do to try to get around some of the limitations of observational research.